The village of Ashenmere did not mourn its dead quietly. It buried them in the dark, in ground too frozen for proper graves, and it moved on before the candles had finished burning. Isolde Vane had learned this the night her mother was carried out on a board of rough-hewn oak, wrapped in linen that was more grey than white, while neighbors watched from behind closed shutters. No one had come to help. No one had offered bread or firewood or even the warmth of a single spoken word. That had been 3 years ago. Now she lived at the edge of the village proper, in a cottage that listed slightly to the left and smelled of old herbs and damp stone. She kept to herself. The villagers permitted this arrangement with the ease of people who had never truly seen her to begin with. It was on the last night of October, the blood moon hanging low and swollen above the moors, its light the color of a wound, that Isolde found the man in the road. She had gone out to pull in the drying rack before the rain hit. The wind was already turning savage, carrying with it the particular cold that came off the northern moors, the kind that got into your teeth and stayed. She had the rack under one arm and her shawl pressed to her face with the other hand when she nearly stepped on him. He was lying face down in the mud of the lane, just beyond her gate, not a farmer. The coat alone told her that, black wool so fine it had no business being in Ashenmere, let alone on the ground. He was tall, even collapsed as he was. Broad-shouldered. His dark hair was matted with rain and something darker at the temple. Blood. Isolde stood still for a count of 3. The rational thing, the safe thing, was to go back inside. She owed nothing to anyone. The village had made that arrangement very clear over a long and quiet 3 years. She set down the drying rack. "Sir." She crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat. The pulse, she found, was wrong, too slow, too deep, with a strange, arrhythmic quality, as though his heart were counting in a different language than hers. His skin was cold, not the cold of someone merely chilled, but something more fundamental, as though warmth had never really been the point of him. He was alive. That was enough. It took her most of her strength to get him inside. He stirred once as she dragged him across the threshold, a low sound in his throat that was not quite pain and not quite anything she had a name for. She wrestled him onto the settle beside the hearth and built a fire up higher than she could afford, then brought water and the clean cloth she kept for her own minor wounds. The gash at his temple was shallow but had bled considerably. She cleaned it without letting herself look at his face for longer than necessary. She had the general impression of something severe and architectural: sharp jaw, heavy brow, a mouth that even unconscious managed to suggest restraint. He was not young, or rather, his face told no clear story about age. It was simply a face that had been held in careful suspension for a very long time. She bound the wound, checked his breathing, and draped her heaviest blanket across him. Then she sat in the chair across the room and did not sleep. He did not wake until just before dawn. Isolde was at the table with her tea going cold beside her, mending a sleeve by lamplight, when she heard the quality of his breathing change. She looked up. He was lying exactly as she had left him, but his eyes were open, and they were watching her with the kind of focused, absolute attention that most people did not manage even when trying. His eyes were gray, not the gray of rain or stone, but something older. The gray of ash after a fire has been cold for a century. "You are unharmed," he said. His voice was low and very even, as though he were reporting a fact rather than expressing relief. "I am," Isolde said. "You are the one who is bleeding." He said nothing for a moment. He seemed to be cataloguing the room, the low ceiling, the dried bundles of herbs, the crucifix above the door that had belonged to her mother. Then his gaze returned to her. "You brought me inside. You were in the road. Many people would have left me there." "Yes," she said simply. "They would have." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened. This was not a face that softened, but altered, the way a very still body of water alters when something beneath the surface moves. "Your name," he said. "Isolde Vane." She kept her hands on her mending. "Yours?" A pause. Very brief, but she caught it. "Valerian," he said. Just the one name. She did not press for another. People in Ashenmere often had reasons for stopping at one name, and she had learned not to ask for more than was offered. "You have a head wound," she told him. "You should not travel until the dizziness passes. The moors in storm take people even without injuries." He did not thank her. He looked at her for a long, unreadable moment, and then he said, "You are not afraid of me?" It was not a question. There was something in his tone that suggested this surprised him, not unpleasantly, but with a kind of measured bewilderment, as a man might look at a thing he had not expected to encounter in the world. Isolde set down her needle. "Should I be?" Outside, the blood moon was finally sinking. Its red light withdrew from the window slowly, like something reluctant to leave, and the room returned to ordinary firelight and shadow. Valerian did not answer her question. He would not answer it for a very long time, but later, when she understood what he was, what title he carried, what centuries had shaped the controlled precision of his voice, she would think of this moment, of the blood moon at the window, of the way he had looked at her from across the room, already still as something carved. Already watching, the way only the very old know how to watch, as though he had found something he had long since stopped expecting. He stayed 3 days. Isolde did not examine this decision closely. She had spare room and firewood enough, and the man called Valerian could not walk a straight line the first morning without gripping the doorframe. Whatever had felled him on the moors had taken something considerable from him. She recognized depletion when she saw it. The careful economy of his movements, the way he ate almost nothing, and yet became incrementally more present each day, as though he were filling himself on something other than the broth she left at his elbow. She did not ask what it was. She had grown up at the edge of things, of the village, of ordinary life. And she had developed an instinct for the questions that open doors better kept closed. He was courteous in the manner of someone for whom courtesy was a discipline rather than an inclination. He thanked her for meals in the fewest words possible. He did not touch her things. When she came into the main room and found him standing at the window in the gray morning light, very still, gazing out at the moors as though reading something in their surface, she simply moved around him and put the kettle on. It was on the second morning that she first noticed the cold. She had been aware in a distant way that the room near him was always cooler than it should be, given the fire's size. She had attributed this to drafts, but on the second morning she passed close behind him to reach the herb shelf, and the cold off his skin was so distinct and so complete that she stopped moving entirely. It was not the cold of illness. It was the cold of something that had given up warmth as a matter of settled principle. She moved to the shelf and took down the rosemary without looking at him. Her hands were steady. She willed them to remain so. "You are mortal," he said. He had not turned from the window. "As far as I know," she said, "and yet you are not frightened. You have had 3 opportunities to harm me and have not used them. I find it difficult to sustain fear past the second opportunity." A silence. Then, from behind her, "Most mortals do not reason to their fears. Most mortals have not lived as I have." She heard him turn then. Not a sound so much as a change in the air, the small displacement of his presence reorienting. "How have you lived?" She considered the question while she bundled the rosemary for drying. How to describe the particular texture of 3 years in which no one had needed her and no one had wanted her, and the days had accumulated like pages in a book no one was reading. "Quietly," she said at last. He did not respond, but she had the distinct sense, standing at her shelf with her back to him, in her listing cottage with its herbs and its gray light, that he was still watching her, and that his attention had changed quality in some way she could not name. That afternoon, she went to the market. When she came back, he was sitting at her table with a book she had not seen before. A slim volume, black-bound, old enough that the spine had gone soft. He closed it before she could read the title. "There is a coven," he said without preamble. 3 miles east. In the Veldmere woods." She set down her basket. "I know. The villagers don't go into Veldmere." "Wise." His gray gaze moved over her face with that cataloging quality she was growing accustomed to. "They have been watching this cottage." The cold moved through her then. Not his kind, but the ordinary human kind. The cold of recognizing danger. Why? Because you were seen bringing me inside. Isolde sat down across from him. Outside, the wind moved through the strict trees in long, sighing passes. She folded her hands on the table and met his eyes steadily, though something in her chest had tightened considerably. "What are you?" she asked. The question sat between them. She watched him decide how to answer, or whether to, and she watched him reach a conclusion she could not read. "Something old," he said, "something the Coven will not want in a mortal's cottage." "Are you dangerous? To you?" He paused. Something moved in those gray eyes, old and careful and very controlled. No. To them? Considerably. Isolde looked at the fire. She thought of the 3 years behind her, the closed shutters and the silent lane, and the grave she tended alone every October. She thought of how the village had arranged itself around her absence, as though she were a missing floorboard. A gap everyone learned to step over until they forgot. The gap was there at all. She thought of how she had dragged a stranger out of the mud because he was in the road, and she was the only one who had seen him. "Then I would suggest," she said quietly, "that you are strong enough to travel by morning." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want me gone." "I want you safe. Those are different things." She met his gaze. "And I want to know why a coven would watch a nobody's cottage for 3 days over a stranger in the road." Something in his expression shifted. That same underwater movement she had noticed the first morning. The deep current change beneath the surface kept perfectly still. "Because they know who I am," he said. "And they know what it means that you helped me." "What does it mean?" He stood then, slowly, with the controlled gravity of something vast restoring itself to full height. The firelight moved strangely across him, as though uncertain how to render what it was illuminating. "It means," said Valerian, "that you are no longer invisible." He left the room before she could answer. She sat at the table in the firelight for a long time, her hands still folded, her tea growing cold. Through the window, far in the direction of the Veldmere woods, something moved between the trees. He told her on the 3rd morning, not everything. She would understand later that what he offered was a carefully selected portion of the truth, the minimum required for her safety. Shaped by someone who had been managing information for longer than her country had existed, but it was enough. He was vampire, this she had suspected. The cold skin, the inadequate pulse, the way he seemed to consume energy from the room without consuming food. All of it accumulated into a conclusion she had been deliberately not drawing. He was old. He said this with a brevity that suggested the actual number would be meaningless to her. The way distances between stars are meaningless, technically comprehensible, experientially impossible. And he was, though he offered this last piece in the flattest possible tone, as though it were the least interesting of the 3 facts. King, not a king of mortals, he clarified, with the patient precision of a man accustomed to such distinctions. King of the vampire nobility, Valerian Voss, first of the ancient houses, sovereign of the Crimson Court, though he used none of these titles himself. She pried them out over the course of an hour's careful questioning, and each one he surrendered with the reluctant economy of someone parting with things of value. "You were attacked," she said. It was not a question. The wound at his temple had been no accident. An assassination attempt. He was at the window again. He seemed to prefer it. The position gave him a clear sightline to the moors in both directions. "The Coven in Veldmere acts in service of a rival house. They drove me onto the moors in a weakened state and expected the dawn to finish what they began. But you reached the road." "I reached the road." A pause. "And you were there." Isolde considered this. Outside, frost was forming on the inside of the glass, which should not have been possible given the fire, and which she was choosing not to examine too closely. "The Coven now knows their attempt failed," she said, "because I am watched." "Yes. And they will move against me." He turned from the window. In the morning light, he was even more impossible. The planes of his face too defined, his stillness too complete, the gray of his eyes carrying that deep century weight. He was beautiful, the way a winter landscape is beautiful, austerely at a distance, with the implicit understanding that it would kill you if you stayed in it too long. "They will move against you," he confirmed. which is why I must tell you what you are. Isolde set down her cup. I beg your pardon. Your bloodline. He crossed the room and stood across the table from her. Not close, the appropriate distance of someone exercising conscious restraint. The Vane family. Your mother's mother came from the Eastern Territories, yes? She stared at him. How could you possibly know that? Because I knew her. Something in his expression moved. Not grief exactly, but the close cousin of it. The expression of someone who has outlasted everyone they ever encountered. Eloan Vane. She was mortal as you are. She carried a bloodline marker, a dormant inheritance from an old covenant between the first vampire houses and the mortal families who sheltered them in the burning centuries. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. You are saying my grandmother sheltered vampires? I am saying your grandmother's family and mine had an accord. That accord extended blood protection to her line. It extended to your mother. It extends to you. He paused. The coven knows this. A mortal under ancient blood protection who shelters the king becomes significant in ways that coven law cannot easily accommodate. Isolde pressed her fingertips to the table. She was aware of something enormous trying to assemble itself in her understanding. Facts connecting to facts. Implications branching in directions she was not ready to follow. You are saying, she said carefully, that I was never just nobody. He looked at her with those ancient gray eyes. No, he said, you were never just nobody. You were simply never told. She thought of her mother, dying in that linen wrap while the village watched from behind its shutters. She thought of the silence that had followed. The years of it, my mother knew. Her voice was level. She had practice at keeping it level. Valerian was quiet for a moment. I believe she chose not to tell you, to keep you clear of it. It found me anyway. It tends to. She stood abruptly and moved to the window he had vacated. The moors were pale and still under the iron sky. Somewhere out there, 3 miles east, was a coven that had watched her cottage for 3 days. Somewhere out there, a rival house was weighing the cost of a mortal girl with an old name and an old bloodline, and the terrible inconvenience of having done the right thing. What do you need? She asked. She was looking at the moors, not at him. I need to send word to the court. My steward believes me dead. The court will be in disarray. A pause, and I need, briefly, carefully, your continued shelter. 2 more days at most. The coven will not move while they remain uncertain of my strength. She was quiet for a long moment. 2 days, she said. Yes, she turned from the window. He was watching her. That still, absolute attention, and for a moment the size of what she had walked into pressed against her chest like a physical weight. But she had walked into it with her eyes open. She had walked into it the moment she had set down the drying rack and crouched in the mud. 2 days, she said again, and then you tell me everything. His expression did not change, but something in those gray eyes, ancient and carefully controlled and carrying the weight of centuries, flickered once, like a candle in a sealed room, as though something in there had not expected to be asked for the truth. The message to the Crimson Court was sent by means she did not ask about. She woke on the 4th morning to find a black bird gone from the windowsill where no blackbird had been the night before, and Valerian standing in the kitchen with the careful stillness of someone who had not slept and did not require sleep. She made tea. He watched her make it with the expression of someone observing a ritual whose significance they understand intellectually but cannot feel. The coven moved last night, he said, toward the village, not the cottage. They are gathering information. About me. About the bloodline. He accepted the cup she offered with both hands, a gesture so human it startled her. He did not drink from it. She suspected he took it simply because she had offered it. The blood memory of your line will be of interest to them. Proof of the old accord could be used as leverage against the court. Isolde sat across from him. Blood memory, she said. Explain that. He set the cup down. Outside, the morning was the color of pewter. In the old covenant, a trace was left. Not magic in the way mortals conceive of it. Not spells. A signature, carried in the blood, dormant, passed from mother to daughter. It proves the accord was made. It is evidence. And what would the coven do with evidence? Argue that the accord compels the court to protect your line at any cost, use you as a political instrument against me. His eyes met hers across the table, or simply eliminate the evidence by eliminating you. She received this with the stillness she had developed over years of receiving bad news without the luxury of an audience. She looked at her tea. She noted that her hands were steady. "I see," she said. "You are remarkably composed. I have had practice." She looked up at him. "I want to see it." He stilled further, which she had not thought possible. "See what?" "The blood memory. You said it is in my blood, that there is a signature. I want to know what is there." She paused. "My mother died without telling me any of this. My grandmother before her. I have been carrying something I did not know about and living with consequences I did not understand for 3 years, alone." Her voice did not waver. "I would like to stop being unaware of my own life." Something moved across his face, not the subtle underwater shift she had seen before, but something that came closer to the surface, something that looked, briefly, like recognition. "What you're asking," he said, "requires a blood read. It requires contact." "Your hand," she said. "That is all it requires, yes? In the old texts my mother kept, the blood memory could be read through touch. I found those texts after she died. I did not understand them then." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are not afraid. You keep saying that, because it continues to be remarkable." She placed her hand on the table, palm up. An offering, not a demand. She kept her gaze on his face and kept her expression neutral. She would not beg, and she would not withdraw the offer. What he chose was his own. He looked at her open hand. He looked at it for what felt like a very long time, and she understood, watching him, that the hesitation was not reluctance, so much as something older. Something that had learned not to touch. Then he placed his hand over hers. The cold was immediate and total, not painful but profound, like stepping from a close room into winter air. She kept herself still, and then, between one breath and the next, she saw. Not visions, precisely. Not images in sequence. It was more like a room opening in her memory that had always been locked. The sudden awareness of a history she had been carrying without knowing. Her grandmother's face, a woman she had never met. And beside her, a figure tall and dark-clad, signing something by candlelight in a chamber with stone walls and torch smoke. The same hand she was touching now, a quill in it over parchment. "I extend protection and covenant to this line, in recognition of shelter given freely without obligation of knowledge or return." The words arrived in her mind not as sound, but as weight. She exhaled. Valerian withdrew his hand. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Careful, and close, and very still in the way a man is still when he is trying not to betray what he feels. "You saw," he said. "I saw." Her voice was quieter than she intended. "You made the accord yourself. 300 years ago. You knew her. My grandmother's grandmother." She looked at him across the table and understood, all at once, what the distance in his eyes had always been. The distance of someone who had watched everyone he had ever known become history. "You protected her family, and then you forgot about us." The silence was considerable. "I did not forget," he said at last. "The court's records were lost in the burning decades. I believed the line had ended. We were simply invisible," she said. "Like I told you." He did not answer. But he did not look away either, and in the long, gray-lit silence of that morning kitchen, with the frost on the window and the cold still in her palm, Isolde looked at the face of the man who had signed her protection into existence 3 centuries ago, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was being seen. It was the most frightening thing that had happened to her yet. The coven came to the edge of her property on the 4th night. She did not see them. Valerian did. He stood at the window in the dark, a silhouette that did not move for 2 full hours, and when she woke just after midnight and came into the main room, she found him exactly as she had left him, still and watchful and utterly removed from the possibility of sleep. They are counting, he said before she could speak. She stood in the doorway in her shawl. Counting what? The wards. A pause. Your mother placed them, her bundles, salt at the threshold, the arrangement of iron above the windows. She knew more than she let on. Isolde looked at the iron hook above the nearest window. She had always assumed it was for hanging things. She told me it was decorative, she said. It is not decorative. She moved to the chair nearest the fire and sat. She was not going back to sleep. What are they deciding? Whether my presence is sufficient deterrent. He turned from the window. In the firelight, he was all shadow and stillness. I am weakened. The assassination took more than blood. There are methods the rival houses use to suppress the older abilities. The coven knows I may not be at full strength. Are you? A pause that told her the answer before he spoke it. No. She absorbed this. Outside, the wind was very quiet, the specific quiet that preceded something, not the quiet of peace. She had grown up on the moors. She knew the difference. Then we cannot rely on your deterrence alone, she said. No. The words will hold for tonight. Tonight, yes. The salt line is intact, and the iron above the east window is placed correctly. He crossed the room and sat across from her, settling into the chair with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to perform ordinary actions consciously. You are not panicking. I would panic later if it became useful. It doesn't seem useful at present. Something in his expression, that controlled architectural face, shifted almost imperceptibly. She had been watching him for 4 days now, and she was beginning to learn his register. The shift was what passed for warmth. You are very unusual, he said. I am very tired, she corrected, which produces some of the same effects. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why did you not leave Ashenmere after your mother died? You were young. There was nothing keeping you. She looked at the fire. It was the kind of question she had not been asked before. Not because no one might have thought of it, but because no one had been paying enough attention to form it. I kept thinking she might come back, she said, and then stopped. Because the thought was more naked than she had intended, and she was not in the habit of nakedness. She corrected herself. I mean, there was the grave, and the cottage, and the things she left. I thought if I moved away, all of it would simply disappear. She paused, which is not rational. Grief rarely is, he said quietly. She looked at him. In 300 years, he had watched every person he had known become a grave. She thought about what that accumulation must feel like, not sharply, but as a weight. The way stone wears. Do you grieve? She asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all her questions. I have learned to carry it differently than mortals do. The feeling does not diminish. The sharpness changes. That sounds lonely. It is, no hesitation. A fact, stated without performance. She looked back at the fire. The cottage was very quiet around them, the small sounds of settling wood and the wind against glass, and she was aware of the strangeness of the moment. A nobody in a listing cottage on the Ashenmere moor, sitting up through the small hours with the vampire king while a coven counted wards outside. Her life had been many things, but it had not been this. Tell me about the court, she said. So he did. Not the politics, not yet, but the physical fact of it. A manor in the northern territories that had stood for 6 centuries, its towers the color of old bone, its halls running for what felt like miles. The way winter came to it differently than to anywhere else. The particular quality of silence in its libraries. He spoke without sentiment, in the careful descriptive language of someone reporting rather than remembering, and yet through the precision she heard something else. The note of a man who had lived so long in one place that the place had become indistinguishable from himself. He had not spoken of it to anyone in a very long time. She understood this without being told. When he stopped, the fire had burned down low. It sounds cold, she said. It is. He paused. Cold is not the same as empty. No, she agreed. I know that too. Outside, the edge of the property was quiet and the coven had retreated. For now, for the night. The wards had held. Isolde rose to put more wood on the fire. She was aware of him watching her as she moved, that absolute, careful attention. and she was aware that something in the room had changed quality, slowly and without declaration, over the course of the night. Not the cold this time. Something else, something she was not prepared to name yet, something that frightened her far more than the shapes at the edge of the property. The letter arrived on the 5th morning in the manner of things that arrived for vampires without explanation, already there when dawn came, slipped beneath her door by hands that left no tracks in the frost. Valerian read it without showing her what was in it. Then he folded it carefully, set it on the table, and told her what it said. The coven had invoked a clause of vampire law, an ancient provision, he explained, that governed the conduct of mortal parties who became entangled in disputes between vampire houses. The clause was blunt in its implications, Isolde. As a mortal who had provided shelter and aid to the Crimson King during an act of inter-house aggression, was now classified as a partisan, under coven law, which claimed jurisdiction over mortal vampire entanglements in unprotected territories. She was subject to summons. "What does summons mean?" she said carefully. "It means they require you to present yourself before the coven council for questioning." He was watching her. Under coven law, a mortal partisan can be held as surety, a guarantee against the continued interference of the house they aided. "A hostage," Isolde said. "The formal term is surety. The informal term is hostage." He did not contradict her. She stood at the table and looked at the folded letter and thought about all the ways the morning had just changed. "And if I do not go?" "The coven has the right, under the same provision, to treat non-compliance as an act of aggression against the house they serve." He paused. "They would use force to take me, yes." She sat down. She looked at her hands on the table, ordinary hands, reddened by cold and work, carrying some ancient signature in their blood that she had not known about until 5 days ago. She thought about her mother, who had known, who had arranged iron above the windows and herbs in careful bundles and had never said a word. "You could argue the old accord," she said. "The blood protection. I could." His voice was measured. "The accord predates coven law by a century. In theory, it supersedes the surety provision, but invoking it formally requires the testimony of a court elder before a joint tribunal. My steward is 4 days' travel away. The coven's summons allows 48 hours for compliance." He met her gaze. "There is a gap." She understood the gap. The gap was 48 hours in which she was legally unprotected and in which a coven council could take her and hold her while Valerian's court was still mobilizing. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The question seemed to surprise him. She suspected he was not often asked what he wanted. He was asked for his commands, his judgments, his decisions. The want was a different category. "I want," he said slowly, "to make certain that this situation does not proceed at my expense while you bear its cost. That is not what I asked." A pause. He looked at her. "No," he agreed. "It is not." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to protect you. I am aware that this creates complications, given the political geometry of the situation. I want—" He stopped. When he resumed, his voice was careful in the way of someone picking their way across uncertain ground. "I want to ensure that you are not made to pay for a kindness. The kindness of pulling a stranger out of the mud. Yes." Isolde looked at the window. The moors were white and still. 48 hours. "There is another option," she said. He waited. "I go to the council." She held up a hand before he could speak. "Not as a partisan, not as a surety, as a mortal claiming protection under the old accord, asserting my grandmother's covenant as active and binding." She looked at him. "If I present myself as a party to the accord, rather than a party in a dispute, the legal footing shifts. They cannot hold a mortal under blood protection without triggering inter-house consequences." The silence was very long. "You read the old texts," he said. "My mother kept them. I had 3 years and very little else to do. You understood them?" "Well enough." She kept her voice level. "I am not proposing this without understanding the risk. If the council rejects the accord claim, if they argue that the dormant bloodline does not constitute an active covenant, then I will have walked into the council chamber without protection and said, so explicitly, 'Yes,' he said, You will have. Do they know about the blood red? She asked. Can they tell it was done? He paused. They may sense it. A blood reed leaves a trace. Then they already know I have confirmed the accord personally. Which means my claiming it is not an empty gesture, it is corroborated. She tilted her head. That changes the risk. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully decipher. The architectural face was still controlled, but something behind it had shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize as significant. The deep current movement, the thing that moved beneath the surface of the most contained man she had ever met. You have thought this through, he said. I have thought very little else all morning. Isolde. Her name in his mouth was, she noted this carefully and set it aside, different from how other people said it. More precise. As though he meant every letter. I will not let you walk into that chamber alone. The wards. Damn the wards. The control cracked. Just once, just briefly. A thin line in the surface that revealed, for a moment, the depth of what lay beneath it. You will not face them alone. She looked at him. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the 48 hours had already begun their count. She thought, this is the moment. This is where it stops being about shelter and bloodlines and old accords. She thought, I am in considerable trouble. They went on the second evening. The Veldmere woods were exactly what the villagers' silence had suggested. Old growth, dense, the trees too tall and too close together, their roots breaking the path in ways that seemed deliberate. The cold was deep. Isolde had put on every layer she owned and still felt the night through each of them. Valerian walked beside her. He had not touched her. He had not spoken since they left the cottage. She was aware of him with the entirety of her attention. His presence in the dark, the controlled economy of his movement, the way the woods seemed to make room for him with a deference that had nothing to do with fear. The council chamber was underground, a carved-out space beneath the oldest of the trees, reached by a staircase of root and packed earth that opened without ceremony. Light came from sources she could not identify, a pale, cold luminescence that had no warmth. 5 figures waited. They were old, not Valerian old. She had begun to understand that his age was a specific and singular thing, but old in the vampire fashion, faces that had been beautiful once and had been kept past their intended duration until they had become something else. Something that watched. The central figure spoke. Isolde Vane. Mortal partisan of the Crimson House, you are summoned for examination. I am not a partisan, Isolde said. Her voice did not shake. She had decided in the cottage 2 nights ago that it would not shake, and she had held to this. A pause. The 5 figures exchanged something, not words, a glance, a shift. You sheltered the Crimson King. I sheltered a wounded stranger in accordance with my grandmother's covenant, she said. The accord between the Vane bloodline and the Crimson House, sworn 300 years ago, extends blood protection to our line and obligates our line to provide shelter to any member of that house who seeks it. I acted in compliance with that obligation. This is not partisanship. This is covenant fulfillment. The silence was very long. Valerian had not moved. He stood 2 steps to her left and slightly behind, and she could feel the temperature differential of his presence like a second skin. She did not look at him. The central figure said, the accord is 3 centuries dormant. Its legality undercurrent. The accord was renewed, Isolde said. Another silence. Renewed, said the figure carefully. 4 days ago. By blood red. In my cottage. Under the original terms of the covenant, a blood red between a bloodline holder and the accord's signatory constitutes formal renewal. She paused. I am the bloodline holder. He is the accord signatory. The renewal is complete. This was, she knew it, and she knew that Valerian knew it, an interpretation of the old text that was aggressive, possibly inventive, almost certainly not the way the original covenant had been intended to work. She had spent 2 days turning the language over in her mind, looking at it from every direction available to her. She believed it would hold. She was not certain it would hold. The council conferred, not in words she could hear. The conference was internal, Something communicated in the register of very old creatures who had long since moved beyond the clumsiness of speech. Then the central figure looked past her at Valerian. "The king acknowledges the renewal?" "I do," Valerian said. His voice was the same as always, low, level, utterly controlled, and instruments of extraordinary precision. Another silence. "The accord," said the central figure at last, "is hereby recognized as active. The mortal is under blood protection. The summons is—" A pause, as though the word cost something. "Withdrawn." The cold luminescence flickered. Isolde let out a breath. She had been holding it for some time. However, the central figure continued, and the word landed like a stone. "The coven registers formal objection to the manner of renewal. A blood red conducted without coven witness cannot be verified independently. We require, in accordance with Provision 7 of the Interhouse Accords, a public bond declaration." She heard Valerian go still. He was already still. This was a different stillness. "A public bond declaration," she said. "A verbal confirmation, in the presence of witnesses, that the king acknowledges the mortal as his protected ward under named covenant." The central figure's eyes, pale, old, carrying no warmth, moved to her, spoken by the king. Binding under Crimson House law. She turned to look at Valerian. She had been careful not to look at him throughout the exchange, maintaining her own footing by force of attention. Now she looked. He was looking at her, that absolute, careful, century-deep attention, something in his face that she could not read, that had moved too close to the surface to be the controlled architectural expression she was used to, and was now something more urgent, and less guarded, and considerably more dangerous. "You are aware," he said quietly, to her and not to the council, "of what a bond declaration implies." "I am," she said, though she was not entirely. "It is not a simple ward arrangement." His voice was very low. "Under Crimson House law, a named protected ward the term is covenant-bound. It implies obligation on both sides. It implies a degree of connection that goes beyond political protection." She held his gaze. "I understand." Isolde. Her name again in that precise and careful way. "You do not have to, I know," she said quietly. "But I did pull you out of the mud." Something passed across his face that she had not seen before and could not name, and would think about for a very long time afterward. He turned to the council. "I declare," he said in the formal register of ancient law, "that Isolde Vane, bloodline heir of the Vane Crimson Accord, is named under my protection as covenant-bound ward of the Crimson House. Let this be witnessed. Let this stand." The 5 figures were silent, and in the cold underground chamber, something old and binding, something that had been waiting 3 centuries for this precise configuration of people and choices, settled into place with the quiet certainty of a lock finding its key. He had ruled for 4 centuries and he had not been afraid of very much. He had been afraid, once, of what he was becoming. In the earliest decades, when the hunger was still new and the distance from humanity still measurable, he had been afraid, once, of losing the Crimson Court to the fires that consumed the eastern territories in the burning century. He had been afraid, perhaps, of forgetting what it had felt like to be warm. He had not been afraid of a mortal in a cottage on the Ashenmere moors. He was, he acknowledged to himself on the walk back through the Veldmere woods, afraid now. Not of her. Never of her. She walked beside him in the dark, her shawl pulled close, her face composed with that remarkable, terrible composure, the composure of someone who had learned to receive everything the world threw at them without flinching because there was no one to flinch with. He was afraid of the specific way she had said, "I did pull you out of the mud," light and factual, as though it were the simplest thing in the world to accept a covenant bond with a vampire king in an underground council chamber. He was afraid of what it meant that she had done all of it, that she had stayed steady through every revelation. The bloodline, the coven, the blood red, the council, and had looked at each new piece of information with those clear, dark eyes and folded it into her understanding without complaint. He was afraid, if he was exact about it, of the particular quality of care he had been feeling for the past 5 days. He recognized the feeling. He had encountered it before in the 1st century, before he had learned to keep his distance from mortals who would not last. He had learned, over the centuries, that it was better not to begin, and yet here was this girl from a listing cottage on the moors, who had given him her hand and seen his memory, and looked at him across the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, and said that sounds lonely, and meant it, not as pity, but as recognition, as someone who understood the specific weight of that particular word. She slipped on a route in the dark. He caught her arm before he had decided to, his hand around her elbow steadying, and then she had found her footing and he released her immediately, and the whole exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She looked up at him. The forest was very dark and his eyesight was not a mortal's. He could see her face clearly, the slight surprise in it, and then the careful neutrality she reinstated. "Thank you," she said. "Yes," he said, which was not quite the appropriate response, but was the one that came. They walked on. He thought, I have lived 400 years, and in 400 years the problem has never changed. The problem is always the same. They are mortal. The time runs differently. I have watched everything I have ever known become the past. He thought, but she already knows this. I told her. And she did not withdraw. He thought, she said, that sounds lonely. Not, how dreadful. Not, I am sorry, she said. I know that too. He did not permit himself to examine this further. When they reached the edge of the woods and the moors opened before them, the cottage lights visible across the frost, she stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The bond declaration, she said. What does it actually require of you? He looked at the distant cottage lights. Protection. Presence, when required. Recognition of your claim under Crimson House law in any inter-house proceeding. He paused. It requires that I treat your safety as a priority that competes with, in certain situations, my own interests. She was quiet. And of me? She asked. Nothing obligated, he said. The declaration is asymmetrical under Crimson House law. The protected party bears no legal obligation in return. He paused. Only the old accord's original terms, which are already in force. What were those terms? He looked at her. In the dark, with the moors around them and the frost coming off the ground, she was very still. Not his stillness. Nothing so deliberate, but the natural stillness of someone standing in a cold landscape and simply letting it be cold. Shelter given freely, he said, without obligation of knowledge or return. She absorbed this. She gave it freely, Isolde said. My grandmother's grandmother. Not because she was obligated, because someone was in the road. Yes. She looked at him. And now the road has found us again. He held her gaze in the dark. He could feel the distance he had maintained for 5 days, the careful space he had been holding with the deliberateness of a man who knew what happened when he stopped holding it. He held it still, but he said, I am glad it was your road. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not surprise, but the expression of someone who has been given a word they had almost stopped believing in. Then she turned back toward the cottage. Come inside, she said quietly. It's cold. He followed her across the frost-pale moors, and the distance between them held, and the space between them held, and every careful thing he had built over 4 centuries held, for now. His steward arrived on the 6th morning. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders emerging from the moor mist at dawn, their breath and the horse's breath clouding together. The lead rider was a woman, iron-haired, formidably upright, wearing the kind of riding coat that suggested it had been tailored for practicality before anyone had thought about anything else. She looked at the cottage with an expression Isolde recognized immediately, the expression of someone who had arrived expecting to find ruins and found instead something structurally intact. Valerian met them at the gate. Isolde watched from the doorway. The exchange was brief. The steward, Mara, Valerian called her, and Mara's face rearranged itself briefly into something that might have been relief before resolving back to its customary rigor, spoke quietly and rapidly. Valerian listened. The more light made everything gray and clean. Then he turned and looked at the cottage, at Isolde in the doorway. She read his face with the knowledge of 6 days' practice. She saw the shift of it, the composure intact, the gray eyes carrying something they had not carried when she had first cleaned the wound at his temple. She went inside and put the kettle on. He came in alone, leaving Mara and the riders at the gate. "The court is stable," he said. "My steward contained the disarray." He stood in the center of the room in the way he always stood, as though he were calculating the stillness required. "It is safe for me to travel." She kept her hands on the kettle. "Good," she said. "That is good. Mara has brought documents." A pause. Legal instruments confirming the Vane Crimson Accord and the Covenant Bond Declaration, registered with the court. The Coven cannot challenge them. "Good," she said again. "Isolde." She turned from the kettle. She had known this conversation was coming. She had spent 2 days watching it approach and deciding, carefully, what she would say and what she would not. "You will be taking the cottage's extra blanket," she said. "It is wool and the journey north is long." His expression shifted. "I am not taking your blanket. You clearly won't use it for warmth. You can use it for decorum." She turned back. "It is old, my mother's. I would like it to travel." A silence behind her. Then, "You are not going to ask me to stay. No, you are not going to—" He stopped. When he resumed, his voice was in a different register. Lower, more careful, carrying something it usually did not. "There are things I have not said." She poured the water. Her hands were steady. She had decided about this too. "I know," she said. "I have lived 400 years," he said. "I have lived them at a distance from this." A pause. "From the difficulty of this. I have had good reasons." "I know that too." She turned and set his cup before him and sat across the table and looked at him steadily. He looked back at her. The room was very quiet. The herbs, the fire, the particular quality of morning light in a cottage at the edge of things. "You are leaving," she said. "That is right. The court needs you. The Coven dispute is not resolved simply by the bond declaration. There are political dimensions that require your presence and your authority. You have a house to run." She paused. "And I have a life here, small and quiet and mostly invisible but mine. The bond declaration protects me. Yes, I'm grateful." She looked at her tea. "I'm not holding you to anything beyond that, Valerian." The silence was very long. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the controlled architectural composure, not the careful authority, not even the brief surface breaks she had catalogued over 6 days. This was something else. Something undone, just slightly at the edges. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time and had, in the last 6 days, been given too many places to rest. "I am coming back," he said. His voice was very quiet, not a reassurance. A fact. She looked at him. "The court's winter session is in 6 weeks," he said. "There are matters arising from the Coven dispute that will require the testimony of the Covenant holder." He paused. "You? I see. It will require your presence at the Crimson Court." She absorbed this. For how long? Several weeks, at minimum. The prospect of the Crimson Court, its centuries-old towers, its libraries, its cold that was not the same as empty, settled into her mind with a weight that was not entirely unwelcome. She thought about 6 weeks in a cottage on the moors, with the wards holding and the Coven quiet and no sound but wind and the memory of a presence that ran too cold for warmth and had put its hand over hers for 2 seconds on the frost-pale walk home. "From Veldmere. That is a legal reason," she said carefully. "Yes." "Is that the only reason?" The pause was very brief, but it was there. "No," he said. She looked at the fire. Something in her chest moved. Carefully, with the caution of something that had been still for a long time and was relearning motion. "Then I will come," she said, "in 6 weeks." He left an hour later, across the moors, into the mist. She stood at the window and watched until the riders were gone. Then she turned back to her kitchen, the herbs, the fire, the iron above the windows, and stood very still in the center of her life, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that it was not ending, that something, in fact, was beginning. He did not sleep on the journey north. This was not unusual. He did not sleep on most journeys. The habit of wakefulness was 4 centuries old and not inclined to accommodation, but this was a different wakefulness. This was the particular consciousness of a man carrying something new, a weight that was not a burden, an awareness that was not yet resolved. He thought of the way she had stood at the window of her cottage as he left, her shawl around her shoulders, not waving, not calling, simply watching, the same steady, undemanding attention she had given everything, as though she had long since learned that things left without drama more often came back than things pursued with urgency. He thought, she has lived her whole life practicing an endurance that should have broken her. He thought, it did not break her. He thought, I have been practicing a similar endurance for 4 centuries and I have mistaken it for strength. The Crimson Court received him in the manner of a house that had nearly lost itself and had not yet fully forgiven the experience. Murrah reported the political situation in her customary succinct fashion. The Coven dispute was known. The bond declaration had caused considerable comment. The rival house was quiet in the way that usually preceded a different kind of action. The court was stable. The winter session would proceed, and the mortal covenant holder would attend. The news moved through the court with the efficiency of things that were both unusual and significant. He heard the discussions, not eavesdropping, simply being present in a house where 4 centuries of tenure had given him access to every register of sound within its walls. There was curiosity. There was doubt, in some quarters, about the wisdom of bringing a mortal into the court's proceeding. There was, in the older members, a quieter response, a recognition of the old accord's name, and of what it meant that it had been renewed. He let them discuss it. He did not issue clarifications or commands. He went to the library. Isolde arrived 6 weeks later on a morning when the northern sky was the color of iron and the Crimson Court's towers were visible from 3 miles away, rising from the landscape with the improbable certainty of something that had decided to last. She had brought 2 bags and the wool blanket. He met her at the gate, not the formal arrival procedure, not the processional welcome due to a covenant holder, simply at the gate, in the cold morning, as a man who had been waiting. He told himself the departure from protocol was a practical matter. He acknowledged, privately, that this was not entirely honest. She looked at the towers for a moment before she looked at him. He was glad. It gave him a moment to arrange his face into something that would not betray the 6 weeks he had spent returning, in unguarded moments, to the image of her in her kitchen doorway. It is larger than you described, she said. You said it sounded cold. It does. She tilted her head. But you said cold is not the same as empty. I did. She turned and looked at him. Her dark eyes were steady and clear, carrying that specific quality, not boldness, nothing so obvious, but the deep, certain attention of someone who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. I read the rest of the texts, she said. In the 6 weeks, my mother kept more than I'd found initially. There was a second bundle, behind the salt shelf. She paused. I understand now what a covenant bond implies, beyond the legal protection. He held her gaze. Isolde, I am not asking for anything, she said quietly. I am not making demands. I am telling you that I understand, and that I am here, and that I am... She stopped for a moment, and the composure wavered, just slightly, just at the edge, in the way that made him understand how much it cost her to hold it so steadily. I have been invisible for 3 years. I have been in the mud of that lane since my mother died. And you... She stopped again. He took a step toward her. This was a decision, not an instinct. He had made very few conscious steps toward anyone in 4 centuries. You saw me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. You kept saying it was remarkable, that I wasn't afraid, but you were the one who kept looking. He raised his hand and touched her face, carefully, with the full awareness of what the gesture cost him, of the 4 centuries of maintained distance it overrode. His cold hand against her cold cheek in the northern morning, and she did not flinch, and she did not look away. I have been looking, he said, since the first morning. She turned her face slightly, not away, but into his hand. A small, unguarded motion, the first unguarded thing he had seen her do. He bent and pressed his lips to her forehead. Brief, careful, absolute. She closed her eyes. They stood at the gate of the crimson court in the iron morning, and the cold between them was not the cold of distance. In the weeks that followed, the winter session resolved the coven dispute through formal tribunal. The old accord was registered permanently in the interhouse records, and Isolde Vane testified before the assembled vampire nobility with a steadiness that left the chamber very quiet. She stayed through winter. She did not leave in spring. She spent long evenings in the library with a king who read to her from books she could not read herself, in languages that had been old when her grandmother's grandmother was born. He brought her tea she had taught him to make, carrying it with the conscious deliberateness of someone who had decided to perform ordinary things, to practice them, carefully, as a new form of endurance. She stopped being invisible. It was not dramatic. It happened the way all real things happen, slowly, and then all at once, and without announcement. She had pulled a stranger from the mud in the road and had not let herself be afraid, and he had been watching since the first morning, and the blood in her veins carried a 300-year-old promise that had simply been waiting for the right moment to be kept. And in the cold towers of the Crimson Court, where winter came differently than anywhere else, something ancient and careful, and very long suppressed, settled finally into warmth. Not the warmth of fire, the warmer kind, the kind that lasts. The END.